This is Big Will from Heavy Hole Podcast, and I'm here with none other than Patrick Moran, the scholarly researcher behind Buried Zine, and also a member of the band Whitby Bay and the band you're soon going to hear more about, Demoniacal. Did I get all that correct, Patrick? That's
right, Will. Yeah, thanks a lot for having us on the Heavy Hole Podcast.
Welcome to the Heavy Hole Podcast, and thank you for your time, man. I appreciate it. I know you've been very busy with the release of this compendium of the first 6 volumes of Buried Zine lately.
Yeah, we started distributing it from March 1st. It's a collaboration with a publisher, Ditto Nation. It's the first time I've not self-published it. And then we just did a launch event in London at a bookshop called Tender Books this week, which was it was really good, really fun, and well attended.
Awesome, man. And I want to get into that. I want to get into, like I said, behind the scenes, the meat of this. Calling it a zine is kind of underselling it, but it's also underground death metal. So the term zine is a term of endearment for a lot of people. So, but before we get into all that sort of thing, man, I'm going to go right back to the beginning. Are you from a musical family? Anyone in your upbringing who steered you into hard rock and heavy metal? And I'm going to throw this in there. Are there any journalists in your family or anyone who kind of works with writing, the written word or anything of that nature too in your family?
People probably can tell from my accent. I'm from the UK. I grew up in Nottingham, which is a city in the middle of the UK, in the Midlands. My parents, they're into music, but they're not musicians. They're kind of boomer generation. So there's a lot of Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Rolling Stones, that sort of thing in the house. So their music was always around, but they weren't musicians themselves. So they didn't get me into hard rock. So that was a kind of a journey I made by myself. So what was the second half of the question? Sorry.
Oh, well, I usually ask, if I interview a musician, I'll ask them if there were any musicians in their family. Given what you do and the extremely scholarly, journalistic nature of Buried Zine, I want to know if there's any journalists in your family, English professors, writers, I don't know, anything of that nature.
All right. Well, both my parents were teachers, but I didn't go and study journalism or English. So I studied fine art. So that kind of makes sense. In the other half of Buried, as well as the kind of the writing and the research element, is obviously the aesthetic of it, and the actual craft of the making of it is really important to the project. So as always, as a kid growing up, I was always really into drawing and art and things like that. But also into sort of fantasy and science fiction. I was really into Games Workshop, Warhammer 40,000, that sort of like darker fantasy, the sort of gothic, Gormenghast, those sort of things. And then, when I came to university, I elected to go to art college, and those kind of influences, though, still wanted to be, drawing and illustrating and doing that sort of thing. And that kind of led on to starting Buried.
Yeah, that's an important point, because this, like I said before, calling it a zine is a little bit of underselling it. And I'll just say, because it does go into the fine arts, and I want to get into the way it's bound and it's printed and all that sort of thing, because that's all a distinction it has against when compared to other publications. So just tell me a little bit. People who are familiar with Buried Zine, and throughout the course of this interview, you're going to realize that you are into the nitty gritty of guttural, brutal death metal, and you like examining how deep it goes, so to speak, in the underground. Where you're from, where you grew up, was it easy to go see bands live? Were there record stores? Did you have access to the underground scene, so to speak? And maybe take me through when you realized that there was music that wasn't commercial rock bands and there was this underground network of music.
So I grew up in the suburbs of Nottingham. And from about the age of like 13, I started to get really interested in sort of heavier music. Again, I think this kind of relates to the kind of interest in science fiction, fantasy, Games Workshop, those sort of things. And I remember I actually borrowed from my local library a copy of Metallica Kill 'Em All when I was like 13, and copied that onto a cassette, and that was really my sort of way into that sort of heavier music was Metallica, Pantera, Machine Head, System of a Down, and this is like the 2001. So like MTV2 was quite big at the time, and me and my friends, everybody I was kind of hanging out with, were in various elements of a what we call like alternative culture. In the UK, we were called Grebs, which is kind of this weird amalgamation of like goth, skater, hippie. It's just all the kind of subcultures, all anything considered alternative, really mashed into one aesthetic. So, we listen to everything from Nirvana to Guns N' Roses to System of a Down to Metallica, Pantera, things like that. Caius. So that was kind of my way into heavier music. And then Nottingham, a lot of people may know, is the home of Earache Records, and so although I didn't know that at the time, but that meant that there was a lot of gigs in Nottingham. So when I was really young, I went to like an Electric Wizard show, I think at like 14 years old. Saw, who else did I see when I was really young? And They Shall Know Us by the Trail of Dead, which is a punk band from, I don't know where they're from in the US, but kind of like super, super aggressive. Like saw them at a really, really young age. So that Nottingham, we were really lucky. There was a lot of bands, like touring bands coming through, and like pub venues or slightly bigger venues. There's a lot of people may know Rock City, which is like a sort of bigger venue. We got to see Machine Head there. Then there's like a bigger ice arena. I got to see like Green Day, System of a Down, supported by Dillinger Escape Plan, actually, which I hated at the time, but
Huh.
now obviously really changed my opinion on them. Uh, so yeah, and then I had friends who were in bands as well, though I wasn't musical myself at the time. Um, I wasn't playing an instrument, but I was always around kind of people who were in bands and people who were putting on shows. And again, those were more like punk or ska or yeah, weird like skate punk, all sorts of that sort of type of music, MTV2 music, and then that kind of then developed. I got into like heavier music when I was a little bit older, well, extreme music, I would say.
Okay, and did you? Well, did you ever take a stab at making a zine, maybe something a little bit more simple before Buried, or was Buried your first attempt at doing something like this?
So before Buried, I was kind of making imagery around metal. So I was really into printmaking, and
Mhm.
I mean, this is at university level. I was kind of doing these sort of woodcut prints of sort of black metal musicians, the sort of very high contrast imagery of like the early Dark Throne albums, Immortal albums. I could kind of recreate that, and but in this very sort of crafty kind of way, which seemed to suit the aesthetic. And then I did a class with just on bookbinding, just a one-off class, and learned
Mm.
how to do it. And I found it, straight away. I was like, this is really cool. Like something I want to do with this. Um, and I've always really liked magazines. I've always been somebody who, well, my generation, we still just about remember a time before the internet. So things like Terrorizer magazine in the UK were really formative for me from like the age of 16, 17. Zero Tolerance magazine when I was a little bit older. So I was always reading magazines, and that was a way to kind of learn about new music, new bands. And I knew about zines. I owned a few, but I wasn't. I mean, at art school, a lot of people make zines of one form or another, but they're usually very, the traditional zine aesthetic. They're very, very DIY, photocopied, things like that. But I was really into these kind of older printmaking techniques. So I was trying to combine that with my love of heavy metal and find a way to kind of talk about bands that I was passionate about, but I didn't feel people were interested in or paying attention to. And also a way to kind of talk to these musicians and just find out more about what they were doing, how they were creating, thinking about the music, because it was, so mysterious, a lot of it. Um, because nobody else was talking to them. So that it was all those kind of like um different elements came together to kind of lead me to start making Buried. But it was really like I never kind of planned for it to be a sort of multi, like, I thought I'd just do one and then that would be it. But then people seemed to be really into it and I really enjoyed making it. So then I was like, okay, I'll do a second, and then we're on to a third. And it became like a sort of editorial research project, but it was never planned to be the kind of I've been doing it for over 10 years now. It was never sort of set up like that.
Just sucked you in, man.
Yeah.
Like the underground tends to do, man. There's a lot there, and I just want people to understand, because it's a twofold thing here: the amount of research and the way you dig into things. There's a scholarly nature to it. Like, you're trying to get a broader picture. In volume 7, for instance, I think it was Colombia and Ecuador. You looked at the very brutal bands from those countries. I know you interviewed me a while back, and you ended up doing a radio show on Buried Radio, which we can get into, where you talked about the history of slam death metal and how a lot of Long Island bands relate to that. So, like, it's not, you don't just kind of like pick and choose a dozen bands and what are your influences, what's your next album going to be called, and call it a day. I mean, there's a lot of research that goes into there. Would you credit that to like your what you learned in college and higher education, just kind of applying that level of study to something you're passionate about?
So I never really thought about it that way, but yeah, I guess it's trying to understand, not just, I want to talk to bands not just about, what the new album is, but the context within which they're working, because that's really interesting. It's like, why does stuff from, say, Colombia sound so different to stuff from Long Island or Indonesia or, somewhere else? It's like, I want to give, with each volume of Buried, I want to give a sort of sense of the scene, the context which this music comes from. I think making, and even though we all kind of like the same type of music, you say it's a kind of unifying thing, but it also comes from very, very different places, and I think that's really interesting to explore and kind of start to understand. So yeah, as you were saying, each volume of Buried has concentrated on a different scene or different type of extreme metal. So the very first issue, at the time, I was very interested in like one-man black metal bands and all the kind of super obscure tape release stuff, the sort of post Southern Lord kind of era of black metal. And so I went out and was interviewing via email bands from all over the world, but who were single musicians, and it's trying to get an understanding of why they were making music by themselves, often in their bedrooms. And then the next issue, I kind of expanded it into sort of people who were pushing the boundaries of black metal, so more progressive stuff. So even I interviewed Liturgy, I think either just before or around the time of their first album, stuff like that, which is on like the edges of black metal. And then I kind of had a sort of real change in terms of the music I was most interested in, really shifted to death metal, particularly slam. There's a few gigs I went to which really kind of changed my opinion in terms of like what I thought was the most interesting type of metal, what connected most to me. And then I did Buried Free is all about brutal death metal from the UK, and then I explored Southern Europe and Turkey, and then I did one on what's after then. I did Southeast Asia, and then Japan after then, and then Colombia, which is the latest one that you have.
Yeah, a lot there. Can I ask, what were the gigs that you say you went to that kind of changed your opinion on slam and got you into that style of brutal death metal more?
I'd always gone to death metal shows. Like I was, really into that music as well. But there was a show I remember in London at the Purple Turtle in Camden, which was like the sort of new wave of British death metal. There was Ingested were there, who had now become hugely successful and very, very different band, but they really were like a brutal death metal band back then. And Pork Farm, who've disappeared, and a few other sort of younger bands who were on the sort of brutal technical slam end of it. And just thought it was incredibly exciting that these bands are coming from the UK. And it was, yeah, that kind of relationship to heaviness, which you get in slam and brutal death. It just kind of suddenly really, really connected to me. The kind of like how visceral it is. And yeah, I just became sort of obsessed with it, and that was a real change in the sort of diet of metal I was listening to. And then that scene, that kind of world, was just not really that well kind of investigated. There weren't that many people talking to brutal death metal bands, apart from the very biggest, say like Dying Fetus, um, and maybe Devourment, but everybody below that, the scenes they were in weren't really kind of being highlighted. And so I thought like, well, Buried would be a great opportunity to do that. And it kind of became a sort of self-reinforcing cycle where I would find something new, and then then I'd want to research it as a fan, but also then for Buried. So, discovering all the kind of brutal death coming out of Indonesia was an amazing period. And like, the from like 2013, 2014, there was lots of stuff, was even more now. And then that led to like other, realizing that Colombia had this very unique sound and this really amazing period of creating death metal in the early 2000s, and investigating that, for instance.
Yeah, if I'm bold enough, if I'm as bold as to say this, I think there's a lot of parallels maybe in our motivations. Why I would do this podcast, and like something you said too, the things that interest you as a fan. That's the I end up kind of just, if I don't pursue those things, the podcast would become tedious to me. You know what I mean? It has to be fun to me to do this type of research, and new band, old bands I find out for the first time, and all that sort of thing. And I think if people go back to the podcast, they'll see like my tastes kind of changing through the years as the type of bands I reach out for and the recommendations we give. So I can appreciate that sentiment, man. And you have in the advertising, I know throughout many editions, there's situations where you're actually the first one to present an English language interview with a lot of these artists, and you've been working with translators. I don't know if you want to get into that a little bit, and maybe I would imagine that's probably presented you with some difficulty and some tedious experiences going back and forth.
Yeah, well, working with translators, I think is, I hugely appreciate the people who've helped me over the years, and it's often people within that scene who are like, who when I've reached out have obviously responded in English, and then I've worked with them to say like, hey, I want to talk to this band or that band. Do you know them? Could you help me contact them? So people start to know a little bit about the project, and then they get interested and motivated to help me. But sometimes it has been friends who have nothing to do with metal. Have particularly a close friend in Japan who helped me with some of the Japanese translation, who is really not a metal fan, but through just kindness and curiosity helped me interview people like Viscera Infest. But she also said it was a great way to kind of learn about an element of Japan that she would never ever really come into contact with. So yeah, it is challenging. Obviously it adds another layer of there's the back and forth between me, a translator, then the translator and a band. And sometimes, if one of those is busy or just not that motivated to take the interview forward, it can take weeks or months to get something to a stage where I think we have enough to publish and Buried. But at the same time, I think it's super worth it to do that, because I don't want to kind of have it where it's only bands who speak English get interviewed in English, and then that's the kind of limit of it. It feels that if I'm going to try and talk about, metal in Japan or Indonesia, then I should be trying to interview people in their own languages as much as possible.
I appreciate that, and that's an obvious limitation that I have here on this podcast. Because I'm not going to name anybody, but I've reached out to several artists over the years who've gotten back to me and said, politely enough, we don't have a member of the band who's fluent in English enough to conduct this interview. You know what I mean? And that's an advantage of doing a print publication as opposed to a podcast or a radio show right there, man, especially in this underground thing. Because I don't want that either. If my platform or any platform to just kind of showcase only artists who can speak English. In the underground death metal scene, that's ridiculous because it's a worldwide phenomenon. And I mean, we want to expose as many people as possible. So sometimes we get people who kind of guest experts, so to speak, who know a lot about that sort of scene or things like that. Man, it's a tough balance, and it's also tough to to pick where there's so many countries, there's so many bands. It's like, where do you start? How do you look like you're not stuck in one region or in one time period? We try to represent new bands and old bands and all that. It's a lot. Now, let me ask you this, because if I was to make a list of people I wanted to reach out to for an interview, I could fill up a whole notebook. How do you organize your thoughts when you're setting out to do an issue? When you're setting out at the very, very beginning of your campaign, to use a role-playing game term. When you're setting out and you say, well, Colombia, Ecuador, this sort of thing, is there an intense level of organization that goes on? And is there I don't know, I'm picturing all the sticky notes on the wall and that sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I kind of start. I mean, it's first of all, it's just kind of like a listening exercise. It's hopping from one band to another and finding what is interesting and what I personally like or think is unique, and trying to get a sense of what story you can tell, or what particular dynamics in the scene are really, really interesting. And then from there, it's really taking that kind of just general kind of overview of the scene, which I have just as a sort of personal kind of, I like this, I don't like that, or to then going into metal archives and then tracing histories of bands and finding the sort of key individuals, like, oh, this person's played guitar on these with this band, this band, this band. It's like you start to then start to see who are the sort of key bands who then disseminated to create several more. I'm sure you do. Well, I know from listening to your interviews that this is a similar project for you. And then you start to get a sense of like, oh, okay, who were the real pioneers here? Like when I went to do the Columbia issue, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Just give me 1 second. But the brother of the drummer from Animals Killing People.
Wilson is the drummer from Animals Killing People. Was it David from Purulence?
Yeah, Purulence. They were really the sort of key bands that, and David particularly, who really started the kind of the first stone that started the ripple of brutal death metal through Colombia. And so you start to work backwards and talk to people, and they say, oh, you should talk to X or talk to Y. As when we spoke about Slam over a year ago, that was kind of the sort of way I would approach any buried project.
Yeah, and just for the listeners, I did interview Wilson of Animals Killing People and Andromorphous Rexalia, and he spoke at length about his departed brother, may he rest in peace, David, and the effect that Purulent had in the Colombian metal community. Just if people want to know a little bit more about that tidbit. That's right, and that's that right there. There's so many stories. I don't want to just get vocal techniques and guitar tunings. I want to get the story. I want to get if there's a family history. We just had the guys from Outer Heaven on. That was last week's episode, and rest in peace. Both of those guys, Zach and Austin, had lost their fathers, but their fathers were both metalheads. Who were very into extreme metal when they were alive. So it was like just getting these behind the scenes stories that humanizes this type of music a lot. And I think that's what if I'm trying to do anything with this, I'm trying to like, trying to archive these stories for history, but also trying to humanize this type of music for people, man, because we are all regular people, you know. Well, there's a lot of there's some people that are kind of exceptional, crazy people in the death metal scene too, but a lot of us are regular people. That brings to mind an interesting note. In all these different people you've communicated with and reached out to and everything, have you ever had any kind of unusual experiences? Somebody who you know, I don't know, you put down the headphones or you read the email and you're like, I'm dealing with kind of an extra person here, man. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of extreme people in the metal community. I've interviewed people who've talked about animal sacrifice and people who've been, who've had criminal cases for different things they've done and stuff like that. I don't know if you have any interesting stories you might want to tell.
Um, I mean, pretty much every metalhead I speak to is the nicest, most generous person. And everybody is usually really happy to be involved in the zine. Um, a few people, um, they'll kind of start the interview they, and then they'll just suddenly like drop off, like, which if it happens quite a lot, like we might do a few questions or they'll agree to a call and then they'll just disappear. And I just have to kind of leave it. So I've never kind of uncovered anything. I think the Visceral Infest guys, actually, they were telling me about, which is in the zine, where they were posting the kind of, I'm not sure, people, they're like a sort of Japanese gore grime band, and their artwork is super explicit, kind of like medical photography, the sort of carcass-esque Mexican disgorge kind of thing of dead fetuses and things like that. And they're telling a story about like posting these images around their town to like promote a gig, and then like the police sort of one step behind them, sort of taking them down as they were putting them up. So you get little kind of funny anecdotes like that, but nothing where I'm like, oh, I can't print this or something like that.
Fair enough, man. That's actually pretty interesting, man. That's fun, and we've discussed the use of real gore imagery several times on our podcast, and kind of going back and forth with different opinions on it and different takes on it and the history of it. So people can look into that. It's a controversial subject. I myself am kind of torn on it. You know, there's a few ways to look at it, but so getting into the fine art aspect of this now, because it's not just these interviews. There's you've. I'm looking at the write up now. This meticulously produced publication also features 19 artists' commissions, including illustrations, fiction essays, VR experiences, sound art, and scripts. VR experiences. I'm not sure how that's like. How do you tie that into this exactly?
Along with the interviewing of bands and commissioning illustrations to kind of accompany those interviews, I've always wanted to kind of tie my kind of interests with art, but to metal as well, but not in a kind of just the pure illustration way, but just commissioning sort of metal associated illustrators to create works for Buried. Although I have done that a little bit, but I wanted to kind of push beyond that. And I think there's a lot of kind of artists who are making stuff which is thematically very similar to metal, but is not typically associated with the genre. So I always say I'm commissioning art along morbid themes. So it's stuff which has a similarity to the aesthetics or the tone of extreme metal, but comes from a very, very different tradition. And trying to bring these together. So this is sometimes fiction writers. It's been kind of sound artists, where again it's not metal music, but the sound, the kind of the approach and the kind of effect it's meant to have on the audience is not dissimilar to heavy metal or extreme metal. And then the VR piece. So people, when you buy Buried, along with the actual book, I attach to the book ribbon a USB key which contains some of this digital work. So the sound art, the animation, things like that. They exist with the book as part of the book. And an artist I worked with previously was starting to move into VR, and so I asked her, Tamsin Snow, if I could commission and work with her to include a VR piece as part of Buried. And so it's this kind of futuristic mortuary which you can walk around, you can explore in virtual reality. With there's kind of like a sort of death metal soundtrack to it, but it's moving around and just seeing these kind of like harsh, concrete, cold spaces where sort of autopsies take place in the future. So she's not from a metal background at all, but really liked the kind of pairing of her art making and the kind of aesthetic and approach of Buried. So we collaborated a few times on these different projects. And this VR experience at the moment, it's available with Buried. You can then access it with a HTC headset or a Google Cardboard headset, but then soon we'll be launching it on the Meta Quest platform as well. So it'll be accessible through QR codes in the zine and on the USB as well.
All right, that's a lot. We've come a long way from using the photocopy machine at work to put up some reviews. I mean, this is I hope the listeners now are understanding why I keep saying it's more than a zine. Really, there's a lot to this, and I want to get into some of the technique now because I'm reading from, like I said, from the copy here, the promo copy. It's hand-bound and laid out akin to a medieval illuminated text. Now, I can look at. You were kind enough to send me a copy of volume 7, and I was, I can look at this and see. But for the listeners, what kind of a process is this? Because this isn't just something you can. This isn't your typical black and white printed word. You know what I mean? And not all of us have have taken classes in the fine arts and that sort of thing. So could you just maybe emphasize how much work and detail goes into the hand bound and the illuminated print, the foil stamping, and what some of these terms mean to a layman like myself?
Okay, so the book, the kind of all the fonts and the actual look of it is based on kind of medieval, or really also like Victorian reinterpretations of medieval texts. So those kind of really sumptuously illustrated, what we call illuminated texts of like copies of the Bible, which were copied out by monks, before the printing press. That's the type of aesthetic Buried is based in, and what I'm trying to recreate, so that all the fonts are very sort of gothic and pointy and slightly difficult to read, but they are all legible, and unlike a lot of logos of the bands, but yeah, it is all readable. So I kind of taken the design kind of principles, the idea of like having lots of like tight, narrow columns of text all lined up next to each other. So it kind of really has the feel of reading this kind of rarefied object. It shouldn't feel like reading like a sort of a normal magazine or book. It's like the text is laid out in a very different, slightly denser format. And yeah, so I do all that design work on a computer. I don't do it by hand. It's unfortunately. And then I do a lot of the illustration myself, or I commission people to illustrate around the text. So pretty much every single band has a bespoke illustration or a couple. And then it's all printed using this method called risograph, which it's the single color, but it's a very rich colored ink. So again, it looks very handcrafted, and it's printed on a thicker paper again. So everything has a kind of like a weight and a presence, and it feels a bit ceremonial to read it, hopefully. And then it is, it is literally bound by hand. So then all those pages are kind of collated, folded, and then they are stitched together by hand at it's done now at a studio called Wyvern in London. I used to do it all by myself. I issues 1 and 2 I did all by hand by myself, like editions of 25 copies of each. But I don't do it myself anymore. But I work with a binder who, they typically bind books for props for television and film, but they also do if somebody has a first edition of like a Dickens or something which they want to be rebound, and they'll go to somewhere like Wyvern Bindery. And they really like that I'm trying to do something new and a bit weird with this, basically, like 19th century way of making a book. And yeah, so they help me like bind it into these hard cases. And the whole point is it really makes you kind of value the reading experience. It's not like reading a PDF. It's on a screen or something like that. It's not like flicking through something on your phone. It's hopefully the care that's gone into each element of it, from the interviews to the illustration to the commissioning of the art, comes across in the way it's produced. So it's kind of like an anti-zine, I suppose. It's like it's not a throwaway thing that's meant to be around for an afternoon or a minute to talk about a particular, like you're saying, like something Xeroxed and have a few reviews or something. It's quite the opposite of that. But it's kind of the aesthetic is meant to reflect the kind of time that goes in and the commitment that all the artists. And I think also it speaks to the craft of heavy metal as well. All the bands, it's so much time goes into making this music. It's so carefully considered. It might sound to most people like a complete racket, but we all know like how difficult it is to make, well. And I want to kind of reflect that kind of like craftsmanship in Buried.
Yeah, I think it comes across, and I think you did a very good job just now of kind of laying that out for people. That's one of the points I really wanted to get across in this whole interview, was how this is not just your typical zine, nor is it like your, as much as I love these books that have been coming out, such as Choosing Death or The Devil's Cradle and so on and so forth. It's not, it's neither. It's its own entity, like you said. Now that brought a question to my mind, what you just said. Have you found that have you discovered peers or contemporaries, not so much in metal, but in people who are putting out these kind of very nuanced, detailed publication? Are there people that are putting out books with this type of bookbinding and printing process for maybe another genre of music or another interest or anything else, but you just kind of now you're part of this scene of like niche publishers or something? I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah. No, there are artists and people making kind of one-off books very, very beautifully. And then I think now you get these kind of more special editions, maybe not so much of books, but even, the way these kind of big retrospective of important records are made, whether you get like a book bound and then like a record, and all of this stuff is all made up. That's kind of similar, I suppose, in terms of the actual techniques to make it. But similar to Buried, I've not come across it, to be honest.
Yeah, it's one of a kind. And it just got me thinking, especially because people can go, if I haven't said it already, people can go to Ditto Nation. Ditto Nation is where they can purchase the compendium of volumes 1 to 6 that was just released. But Ditto Nation also publishes some other books, and they have some other very interesting, unusual books. So it just kind of got me thinking that there's more out there than you're necessarily going to get at your local Barnes and Noble. There's a whole world out there of independent publishing. Now, you said yourself a while ago, you said when you first set out to do this, you didn't expect it to turn into a 10-year, 7+ volume thing with a reprint, this big compendium you're doing now. What has changed along the way? I know, me, just in like 3 or 4 years of doing this podcast and speaking to so many people, it's completely flipped my whole perspective on music and on death metal and on the scene and everything. I don't know if you want to, maybe you haven't changed at all. Maybe it's just kind of assured your footing. I don't know. But I'd like to get your take on that, on how this whole process has affected you and maybe your perspective on the scene.
Um, well, I think just in terms of making berries, it's I've realized that the amount of elements to making a book or making a zine and the amount of care you can put into it, like I feel every time I make one of these, I then want to do the other another because I've learned so much from the previous one. So and I always can see how it could be better or different or more. So there's been like a real development of learning about really, and I think people will see this in the compendium. My writing and interviewing is much better in the later issues than the early ones. The illustration is, I think, yeah, definitely has more care to it. So there's a real kind of development in terms of what I can add to each edition, each volume. In terms of how it's changed my perspective on the scene, um, I think because because each scene, each volume has really dealt with different parts of the world. It's kind of each one feels like its own unique thing, and each one is like its own like journey of like discovery and exploration, and is really exciting. And I always think like I've reached the end of this, and then I'll find somewhere else or some place else or another group of musicians I really want to talk to, and it just kind of fuels my passion for brutal death metal. Um, yeah, so it's not really changed. I would say it's just like it kind of deepens and intensifies my fandom, but also what I want to create with it in terms of the next buried.
I can relate to that, man. I appreciate that sentiment. That being said, like we said, there's so much more to Buried Zine than I think we could really put into this podcast. I just want people to get an idea of the depth and the amount of work that goes into it so they can check it out for themselves. I know you have the Buried Zine Big Cartel, which, in addition to the buried compendium, you put out a split 7-inch. I mean, we haven't even gotten to this yet. You put out the wormed Copremesis split 7-inch, which for fans of brutal guttural death metal is a pretty historic release there. Copremesis, obviously, people know that Paulo has been on our program here on the Heavy Hole podcast several times, and he talked about a lot of this brutal guttural ping death metal for like 3 episodes. Wormed, I think, should go with no introduction. People know them. Just maybe give me a little backstory on that. I know Paulo kind of like was either hooked you up with me or me up with you, whatever it was, when you were looking for the interviews, and that's kind of how we got to know each other. But just tell me about that. Was that your first venture ever into releasing music and putting out a physical copy of a record or something like that? I don't know.
So I had another project which I'm sure we'll get to. The band I'm in, Whitby Bay.
Yes.
I had put an album out with them before, which I kind of self-published or kind of associated with Buried. But the Copremesis Worm Split is a collaboration with a specialist label in the US, in Long Beach, California, called Stay Free, where they just put out 7-inch records, nothing else. And they're definitely not a metal label, but they're always looking for unique and interesting 7-inch projects. And John, who kind of founded it, I met him completely unrelated to metal, but we kind of shared a love of music and kept in touch. And when he started this label, he said, like, would you want to do a metal, a buried 7-inch? And this was just kind of before COVID, I think. We started the project, and I had this idea. I really like like live death metal recordings. Like I love that kind of that really raw, unpolished sound, which is becoming less common. I feel like there's, as production moves on, what the records bands want to put their name to, get slicker and slicker, which is good and great in its own way. But I do miss, the kind of first releases of different bands. And then it during COVID, it kind of took on another meaning of like, we couldn't go to see any live music. And so I figured putting out live releases of some really legendary bands would be a really nice project. But then I wanted to sort of make it as buried as possible. So for the Capremisis side, I commissioned Toshio Maeda to do the artwork, and he's the kind of the originator of the kind of tentacle porn manga. He's a real he did an anime called Otsuki Doji in the late 80s, which yeah, just seemed like absolutely the perfect fit for Paolo's kind of interests and Capremisis. And it turns out he was a huge fan of that manga anyway. And then with the Worm side, I got the Worm guys to do some sort of new artwork in their style. So along with the 7-inch, you get this huge poster which has the artwork for both bands on it as well. So it's really trying to, again, like the zine, like give it as much kind of like love and care to the packaging as there is which goes into the music on it.
All right, man. Yeah, again, meticulous detail, more than meets the eye. People might see that cover and not realize how deep it goes, given the artist you commissioned and the connection to the band. Always something under the surface with what you're doing. Now, you gave me a good segue there. I apologize. We're this late into the interview, and I'm just bringing up your band, Whitby Bay. But that's because I wanted to really emphasize for people the depth of Buried Zine. But your band, you are the drummer and vocalist, if I got it right.
Yeah, yeah.
We skipped that part about your upbringing and your background. How long you been playing drums?
So I started quite late. It's actually kind of a similar time to starting Buried. So I was maybe 21, 22, something like that. And yeah, it was just with friends who were at the same art college as me. We kind of had this job where we were taking down some of the studio spaces, but then we also, the other two kind of people who were doing this with me were musicians, and they were saying, oh, we should form a band and use this space that we're currently demolishing as a practice space. So we formed a hardcore band called the Self Underrators, which I'd never played drums before, so it was a real like very simple project. But then one of the members, who was kind of the one who was most into hardcore, he kind of didn't turn up to a practice, and then me and the other guy I was like, well, let's do a black metal project as well. And so just very rudimentarily started, playing blast beats and started to figure out, what that project could be. And then I've kind of like learnt the drums through playing Whitby Bay, if that makes sense. So I've kind of self-taught through trying to create different parts of the music, different, okay, this should have this type of beat or that, or this feel or something. And then quite quickly, I wanted to sing on it as well. So that just kind of became, and it also became a bit of an excuse to be like, well, if I'm singing, the drums could be simpler. So, because I'm doing everything. But that doesn't hold up too long, because yeah, it's metal, so the drums need to be good. And yeah, it's a project me and a very good friend, Victor, who's the guitarist and the main songwriter for Whitby Bay, have developed over the last, well, it must be going on 15 years now. And yeah, we've put out one album called Gothic Attack Vehicle. There's a couple of videos we've made for it as well, back in like 2016. And then we did a couple of shows again post COVID, one in London, one in Norwich, at the end of last year. And we're hopefully going to do some shows in Manchester and Leeds in May as well. So it's starting up again.
Okay, man. And the name Whitby Bay, I know, I did a little research. I know there's a reference to the original Dracula novel with Whitby Bay. Is that where you guys are coming from, or something else?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
It's in the Bram Stoker story. It's where Dracula's coffin is dragged ashore into the UK.
God, okay, man. Interesting band, like kind of a blackened death and black a vibe. Definitely worth checking out for people. You mentioned Gothic Attack Vehicle is your latest album, and before we were rolling, you told me about Demoniacal. It is right as a new project that you're involved in.
Yeah, so this something started during lockdown with another friend, and it's similar setup. It's just guitars and drums. I'm not singing on this one. Richard the is Rich is singing on it, and it's slightly different. This is I don't know how to describe it yet. We're going to have a demo out soon, so I think that will it's that point when you start to play with a band and you don't you don't know what it sounds like. You kind of do it, and then you need to kind of record it and like listen to it, be like, oh, okay, this is what it sounds like, or this is what it sits next to, kind of thing. So we're a bit too close to it, I think, at the moment. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's good.
All right, fair enough, man. So I encourage people to check out Whitby Bay and to keep on the lookout for that Demoniacal, and to follow Buried Zine on social media, maybe for any more news. Beyond that, Patrick, as we wind down, I'm going to ask you for some music recommendations. But is there just anything else I may have neglected to bring up? Or that you want to discuss about Buried Zine or about your bands right now? I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot with the zine and the history of the zine. So I tried to cover as much as I could.
No, I think with the zine, as you said, we've just put out the compendium of the first 6 volumes, which yes, like published by Ditto. I'm gonna I have started work on like volume 8 as well. So that's a project which is in development and we'll be announcing some information about in the future. But it's at the research phase at the moment. But I hope, maybe towards the end of this year that should get released. But yeah, I think we've covered. That's all my metal projects. We didn't mention I did the radio show.
Yes.
For through COVID for on a local station here in London. But I've kind of paused that for the moment to focus on getting another zine done. I think it was really great to do a radio show, and I appreciated interviewing people in a very different format to the zine. But I realized in terms of the time it takes to do, I was kind of delaying getting the next zine out, and I wanted to kind of focus on that again.
Fair enough. I would just say if you wanted to do that platform again, you were good at it, man. You produced some really good episodes of the Buried Zine radio show. And they still hold up, even though they're, a year or two older. So people can go to mixcloud.com. I didn't even download the app. I just went to mixcloud.com off of the link you have on the Buried Zine Big Cartel, and you could search Buried Zine. And what do you have, like 6 or 7 episodes on there that came up? Really great, because what I enjoyed too, there's an episode on the slam death metal thing, and you actually, like a radio show, you play the songs, so people can put this on when they're whatever they're doing. They're changing the oil on their car, or doing the dishes, or hanging out, or whatever. And you get these songs, but in between each song, you kind of briefly give a little bit of context and history. You also interviewed a couple of artists, so I just think it was you did a really good job, man, and I want to steer people that way too, just so that's like a quicker way to maybe get an idea of the insight and the kind of research you put into your product. So again, people can just go to the Buried Zine Big Cartel. You have all the links right there. That being said, one more thing. You told me you did a kind of a launch party, I guess you could say, for the book at a bookstore by you. Just for people in the UK who might be listening, are there any other events planned, or any shows that one of your bands might be playing, if you want to plug that?
There's no Buried events planned at the moment, but if anybody is interested in putting on a Buried event, I'd be really up for putting something together. Either I've never really combined actually having bands and doing this, like kind of presenting Buried. So we could do something where, basically at the launch, as well as being able to buy the book, I brewed my own beer with a good friend of mine, which we call it Floating Head, which is the name of one of the Whitby Bay songs. Um, so as well as that, it was a venue to kind of show some of the kind of artwork around Buried. So I covered the bookstore in these big kind of poster prints of Buried illustrations and Buried covers. And then I had a video show reel running of some of the kind of audio pieces and some of the video work, which comes with the Berry Compendium. And then I had a actress reading one of the pieces of fiction from Buried as well. So it felt like there was no live band, which would obviously be great, but it was a good kind of sense of like the kind of content and the aesthetics of Buried.
Wow. All right, man. Yeah. Again, never cutting corners. Never taking the easy way out. We've been bouncing around the idea of trying to do a Heavy Hole podcast live event with like maybe a live interview and the artist will perform somehow. But it's tricky because you don't want the energy to come up and come down at a live music event. So we don't have anything booked as well, but we're thinking about that, man. Patrick, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you now, as we wind down, as I typically do, to recommend one older and one newer piece of music for anybody, a demo, an album, metal, any other genre, whatever it is, just something old and something fairly recent for the people.
For old, what's your old school time window?
I mean, I don't really have strict rules. You know what I mean, man? Because also we have younger guests sometimes, and their old school pick will be like that's old already. I don't know, but it's a loose thing just to get two kind of recommendations out of you for people. It's all good, man.
I suppose for old school, for brutal death, for me is like the very late 90s, early 2000s. So. I don't know if you could play these guys much before, but Prophecy.
Wow.
I think they're Texas.
Yes.
I saw them years and years ago in London. And yeah, amazing show. And that first album is, I think it's called The Beginning. It's really, really good, underrated bit of like brutal death, kind of there's a bit of slam in it. I mean, they became very slammy later, but I think it's a really good album. And if I can cheat, I feel like as a European, I should also recommend something European of that era. And I think the Dutch scene around then was so good.
Yes,
Crimea,
yeah.
Disavowed, but Brutus, Slatch Beast is an absolute beast of a record. So good. It's not as well known as some of those others, as Severe Torture, things like that.
You said Brutus and Slash Beast is the name of the album.
I think Slatch Beast. I mean, I'm not
Slash
sure the Dutch
Beast. Okay,
but that is a really, really good, relentless drumming. Really, really good album.
I do notice that like the Dutch seem to have like a handle on the brutal type of death metal like earlier on. Like, it's like some of those old bands are just, just as brutal as your Suffocation or whoever you want to talk about, man. Definitely an underrated scene. Everyone wants to talk about Swedish death metal and Norwegian black metal, but yeah, there's certain countries that have an underrated tradition of brutal death metal, man. And that Prophecy, man, I love Prophecy, man. I'm a big fan. I've reached out for an interview once to the main guy, James Parks. I'll reach out again. But the album I have is Foretold Foreseen from the late 90s. It's just such a brilliant combination. It's like Dying Fetus kind of style slam, brutal death metal of the time, but you could tell that there's a very melodic thrash metal caliber of like musicianship. They throw in some really excellent solos and kind of harmonic parts. It's a brilliant album, and they're still around. I want to say Defeated Sanity came to the United States a few months ago, and Prophecy was part of that tour. It only hit the West Coast, so it was either Defeated Sanity or Wormed. I think it was Defeated Sanity, and Prophecy was able to open up for them on several dates of the tour, but it didn't come out east here, so I didn't get to see it, man. But great picks, man.
Oh, thank you. And so I'm going to cheat again. Okay, for my new school, do you know Meshum from Turkey?
I do not.
Enigmatic Existential Essence. So it's a new standard elite release, but it's not the sort of normal new standard elite sound. It's a
Okay.
bit, it's tighter, it's more kind of slightly more discordy, I would say, a bit more death grind. It's a phenomenal album. I think it's really, really good. I think it came out 2 years ago now, and it's one which I don't think got enough praise. And it's a one-man band, does everything absolutely brilliantly. And again, might be butchering the name, Urshiol, Pools of Green Fire, which came out last year. It's like a New York based band, with, I think it's one of the guys from Yellow Eyes. It's a really weird sounding death metal album, but it's brutal
Huh.
death metal album. Really, really good.
Could you spell the band name for me?
Urshiol.
Okay, man. Look, worth looking up. Yeah, Yellow Eyes. Those guys always doing something kind of interesting, man. I should reach out. Well, Patrick, I thank you so much. Not only for those recommendations, for your in-depth talk about all the hard work that goes into Buried Zine. We wish you the best of luck as that compendium inches forward to selling out. It is a limited edition. People should know that. So act fast. Don't wait for your Christmas list or something like that. And we wish you the best of luck going forward into Volume 8. Is there anything? Do you want to give us any teasers, or do you want to keep it totally locked up secret about Volume 8?
Um, maybe I'll just put it out there because it might get people to contact me. And but the conversation that we had and the kind of radio show around doing a kind of history of slam, is something I really want to now tackle as a book. I think it would. I kind of did that, brief kind of teaser radio show, which was interesting, but was kind of like very much an intro. But I would really like to, and yeah, do like a deep dive on what was happening in Long Island. But I think it goes, yeah, there is a broader US international kind of element to it
Oh
as
yeah.
well. So I think, yeah, that if I can, it's harder to do because I think a lot of the bands are broken up or people just aren't interested in the scene anymore. Um, but yeah, I think that would be a good next step for Berry to kind of do something, which is not just kind of documenting well, I kind of started to do it with the Columbia volume, which was really talking mainly about the early 2000s. So I think it'd be nice to do that again, but on a scene which obviously has a huge impact.
Well, you know how I feel about that, man. That's great to hear. Very excited to eventually see that, man. Again, if we at the Heavy Hole can be of any help, or our listeners can, man, feel free to reach out, in terms of research or anything like that. But you do pretty good on your own there, Patrick. So I won't be holding my breath. But thank you very much for your time. Again, people, check out Buried Zine, check out Whitby Bay, and keep your eyes peeled for Demoniacal, your new project. Thank you so much for your time, Patrick. Any parting words for fans of your work and listeners of our show?
Well, I just want to say a big thank you to you, Will. Like I listened to the Heavy Hole podcast, and yeah, really appreciate being able to talk about my work and what I've done on it, and share my ideas about, and well, most importantly, share my recommendations. Like that was the part of this I was really looking forward to. So thanks again. I mean, you do this. You talk about me being industrious. Like I think what you do with this podcast, putting them out, week after week, I know how much work that is, and your passion for the scene is so big and so strong, and I really do appreciate what you guys are doing.
Thank you for the compliment, man. It's a mutual respect, and I can never take full credit, man. We have a big production team here at Heavy Hole Podcast that helps me do it. So I appreciate it, man. Patrick, thank you for your time, brother. We'll be in touch in the future, and we'll let the listeners know when issue 8 comes out.
Thanks a lot.